I wanted you guys to get into this kind of historical geographical understanding of things to really start to build a framework when you're explaining theories. You're not just comparing words with words, and you're not just um, going, oh, it says this here and that sounds like that, so let's just tie these two things together and pop out a theory. When you get all the variables in play, the end times is inevitable. It's not like, I mean, all of history is inevitable. You can just see how God sovereignly set it up and controls it the way He does, and to keep Israel at the center focus and to spread the gospel. And when you start to see that in everything, your eschatological prophetic interpretations are going to be a lot less speculative. They're going to be your theories are going to be a lot less strange because they're going to just going to be reasonable. And that's what I want to do is I want to lay out some of that as a groundwork before we get into actual prophecies, and then when we start talking about the countries and the geography and whatnot, it's gonna be a lot more sensible. Okay. So for starters, I just researched this today. I was trying to find out like where Moses and Shem and Ham and Japheth and all these people were buried and whatnot. To the best of my knowledge, this is where the ark lands in Mount Ararat, and there's a little area I'm going to show you between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So this is actually Azerbaijan, but you see how it's all sandwiched in Armenia right here. There's a
Yeah.
town here that is called the place of first landing in like a Turkic language. That's what it means, and that's where Noah's buried. They said so. The ark would have landed like maybe like right here, Mount Ararat, and this is probably like after the boat landed. This is probably one of the first towns they built because really what you have here is when I talk about how the table of nations got to where it is and stuff, like you really only need to understand two criteria to understand logically why the nations are where they are in the table of nations. There's two. There's going to be a third and fourth one that are going to come into play, but the two main ones is really a starting point. So if I'm starting a town or civilization or colony or whatever, what's the number one thing I need?
Water.
Water, right?
Yeah.
So if the ark's right here, we know from Genesis 1 it says they traveled. Some will say to the east, some will say from the east. I believe it's from the east, and it says they settled in Shinar. Okay, so Shinar is right here where Babel is. Um, where Mount Ararat is right here. If you see this right here, these rivers right here, they
Hmm.
all spill into Euphrates. So they would have had to have gone from the east for hundreds of miles to get to the point where the Euphrates starts coming down here. And by then they probably would have found the tigers and all that. Because what you're gonna do is, if you imagine this is Noah and his kids starting out, you just have 10 people, right? And then they start having kids, or they have 8 people, and we know like the Jews turned, you know, a small tribe like that in 70 people in the space of about 100 years, right? And then in the space of another like 200 some years, that 70 multiplied to a few million, right? So we can kind of use that as our template to know how the original people probably were too. So they get off the ark with 8 people, and over the course of 100 years, they probably have about 70, and over the course of like 300 years, they probably have like a few million, right? Because they're just multiplying and multiplying. Well, you can put a few million people in one city if you want to, but they know Noah knows Noah's still alive. He's alive for 400 years after the flood. He knows how civilizations grow and stuff, so he's actually intentionally sending them out to colonize other places. And what you have is that's the number one criteria is water, and the number two criteria is um, the rule of the oldest. So this tradition would go way, way back, and what would happen is when father was preparing to die, what he would do is he would give each of his sons a portion of the inheritance, whether that's land, produce, actual money, whatever it is, and he would give the eldest a double portion. And typically, since the eldest has that seniority, the younger are going to get pushed away. So, in other words, the main homestead that dad spent 100 years or whatever building up with farms and villages and whatever, he inherits that. His brothers got to move away and colonize, right? And this would have been peaceful for probably, honestly, up until Nimrod came. Okay. So Nimrod would have been a third generation, but he was probably like a couple hundred years old before he tried to take over stuff, because he lived to be something like, I think, between 300 and 400 years old before he died. And so what you have is mostly peaceful resettlement, and that resettlement is going to push the younger ones downriver. Okay. So your first major division is Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? So Japheth is the oldest, and so he's going to stay right here. And then next to him, Shem's going to get pushed downriver, and just kind of like Lot went with Abraham, Cush is, or I'm sorry, not Cush, but Ham's going to go with him, right? And then as they get to, because again, he's going to inherit this right here, and they got to go. So they're going to go down to here somewhere. And then when they get so big, then Ham's got to go, right? He's going to take his people and move on, right? And so that's why what you have in the original dispersion is you have your Japhethites are going to be mostly up here. Your Semites are going to be mostly up here. And then your Hamites are going to be mostly down here. And your Semites are going to be, let's see here. So kind of keep that in your mind. We're just going to shrink these down and open up some other ones now. So the oldest son of Japheth, his name is Gomer. And you have Noah dying, but then you have, because Shem, Ham, and Japheth only lived to be about 600, and Noah lives to be about 900. They were all born about 100 years before the flood. So Noah lives about 400 years after the flood, and they all die within the next 100 years after that. So that's why you don't have places named after Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They're going to be named after their oldest kids. And that's always how it's going to be in the Bible. You're going to be to the third generation before your tribe has a name, because you're not a big enough people yet. And it's by the time the forefather is too old to lead, that's when the tribe's big enough. And so usually what you have then is you have a man who's kind of in his prime, but he's the eldest son of the eldest son, and then they name the tribe after him. And so that's why all your nations originally were named after, these are basically the grandchildren of Noah, okay? So like the oldest son of Japheth is Gomer, and then of the Japhethites, you're going to have Gomer, and then the next to him is going to be Magog. That's where Gog's going to come from. We'll get into that later. And then after him is Meshach. And after him is Media, which is right down here. He's going to be actually just south of Gomer, but I think he migrates around here a bit. Those are going to be the main, and then Javan and Tyrus are the other two. So Javan's the forefather of the Greeks. Tyrus is the forefather of the Trojans. So they would be right here. And what you have is basically everybody's kind of pushed out in a circle around Gomer, right? But Gomer's got that center. And Gomer basically grows up to be the Armenian kingdom, which was actually the first kingdom to accept Christianity wholly after the apostles. That's pretty cool. And then Gomer's going to have 3 sons who are also going to grow up to be nations. And of course, his 3 sons are going to be around him. And you have Togarmah, which is the forefather of the Turkmen. So the Turks, all your stand countries. Riphath, they had these mountains that were named after him called the Riphean Mountains. They eventually became called the Urals. And somehow Riphean got transliterated into Russian. So the Rus or the Rosh people were the descendants of Rishbash. And then the Ashkenaz end up being the Germanic peoples. So the Ashkenazi Jews are Germanic Jews. And there's different tribes that come from them. There's all these different tribes and nations that come from them, but that's the main ones. And so, of course, since Gomer's pretty much the main boss, when he has his 3 sons and he sends his 3 sons out to make up kingdoms, he's going to push his other little brothers outward, right? Well, so we talked about those 2 things being water and then the rule of the firstborn. The next thing is going to be horses. And horses really started, the breeding of horses started up here with the Armenians. I mean, they had horses and they probably rode horses and stuff before Noah, but it was there that they really got it going again with horses, because you had down here is desert and then mountains, but up here you had all these plains. So there's where you could really get going with horses, right? And so these guys, because they had horses, they could travel further and further and further away to find the next river over, right? Because you had a horse, you could go farther, right? Whereas the guys who didn't have horses, their main recourse is to go downriver, because you can't get so far away from water because you don't have time to spend a week digging a well before you die, right? Like, so
Right.
you're mostly traveling just downriver, but the guys with the horses can get going and get moving out further and further. So what you have then is, by the time you get to this is probably around the time of Abraham when Nimrod starts taking over, is you have Japhethites up here, but they're starting to spread out, and so they're more sparse. And so even though they're the seniority people, they're more spread out. So you don't really have a consolidated group that you can raise a big army to stop Nimrod. And they're up here. And Nimrod's the son of Cush, and he actually starts taking over with just 300 men. And in the Bible, his name is Amraphel. Nimrod is a title that basically means the renegade or the rebel, but Amraphel was his actual name. It says remember when Abraham fought those 4 armies or whatever, or the 5 armies that he fought to rescue Lot? Well, Amraphel was the leader of those armies. And so Amraphel has this title, King of Nations, which I think was probably like his protege that he was grooming up to rule over his kingdom. And then he had the Elamite kings, which was the eldest son of the Shemites, who he probably subjugated. And then this other king that was from the smaller kingdom that I don't really know, but they're all essentially from this era. So the way you would go when you're subjugating a kingdom, you're not trying to take them over in terms of like a centralized federal government where you control everything. They're more like tributary allies, right? Like, I will go to war against you if you don't send soldiers to join me in my war over here. And the idea is just like if you ever watched the movie Troy with Brad Pitt, it's like that, right? Like, you guys are going to follow my army now, right? So that's how they would do it, and that's how you could take over a kingdom with 300 men. Because the idea is, if we can just get to your king and threaten his life, the idea is, in order for your civilization to stay whole, you have to be subservient to us. Otherwise, we'll fight with each other, and you might stop us from taking over other kingdoms, but you won't stop us from destroying you. So it was really a punk game. It was like, just strong manning everybody, right? Right. And so what he does is he builds up his kingdom here, and it says the beginning of his kingdom was Akkad and Iraq, which is where the name Iraq comes from, and then Akkad, and then a couple of other places, and then it says he builds Nineveh. Well, what he probably does is he builds Nineveh to kind of be a centralized watch city, like how David put a garrison up in Damascus to keep an eye on them. That's probably what he did with Nineveh, is to build it up there to keep an eye on the Assyrians, which were the next oldest Semite people, and kind of keep them under control. But he also put it up the Tigris River, because if the Japhethites were ever going to try to overthrow him, they would need this river, right? And so he's got a strong fort up the Tigris River. And so you have to get kind of past the Tigris or go all the way around here to get to the Euphrates. So that kind of was like his bulwark against them making a comeback against him. And once he had that, now he was free to basically just oppress everything south of there. So you have the Elamites that are kind of up this river system right here. And then you have the Semites that are mostly up the Euphrates River here, because remember, they were the ones that pushed them down south. And then Nimrod is a young son of Cush. So Cush would have been old. Like Cush would have probably been 300-400 years old by the time Nimrod started making war, right? And what you have with the Cushite people, they were smart. So the Cushites were essentially your Sudanese, your Ethiopians. Basically, the darkest skinned Africans would have been descended from Cush. Right. And you had 2 main peoples who were your first seafaring peoples in the world, and those are going to be your Cushites, and those are going to be your the Greeks and the Trojans, so Javan and Tyrus, those ones. they're going to start, going around these seas and in the Mediterranean. And then the Kushites are going to go all throughout the Indian Ocean. And the Sidonians and the Danites and people like that start getting into it later. But these are the ones who really start getting going with colonization. And of course, when you go sail these ships, you're not just trying to sail across the ocean to see what you can find. The smart thing to do is like, I got to find the next river over because that's the next place where we can colonize, right? So don't waste your time trying to go through a desert and climb over mountains and stuff. Just sail along the coast until you get to the next river, right? And so like people think like it took them thousands and thousands of years to figure this out. And it's like, no, it doesn't. All you really need is like a raft with a sail on it, right? Like that's all you basically need to get moving, right? And all you got to do is get to the next riverbed, right? And you can fish as you go, and all you need is some fresh water. So that's all you have to do is to get to the next riverbed. And usually the next riverbed is less than a day's journey away if you're sailing, right? So there's all these little rivers that would be up and down this coast because this was actually more tropical back then. And then all along here. And then the two big ones that they really get to are going to be the headwaters of the Nile up here. And then the other ones are going to be the headwaters of the Ganges River, which is where the Indian civilization first started. And so I actually just found this today when I was looking for where Ham was buried, which would be Cush would be the oldest son of Ham. So Japheth and Noah would probably be chilling with Gomer and they'd be buried around there. Japheth might be buried on the island of Crete. He might actually be Zeus. But Ham is actually buried in this tiny little village that's just shy of Kashmir. That's what they say. And Kashmir is where basically the Himalayas start spilling down the rivers that go to form the big Ganges River that make up the Hindu civilization. So what these guys did, the Kushites did, is they understood like, okay, the top dogs are the ones at the top of the river, right? And that's actually still kind of true today because back then it was about you having the prime lands for, crops and stuff like that, right? Because that's where the rivers start. But now it's like you have hydroelectric power. So that same basic formula still applies today, okay? And so they're at the headwaters really of the Nile River because that's two rivers that start in Ethiopia and Sudan. And that was their territory right here. And you end up with probably Cush is probably buried somewhere around here. And then Ham, his dad, is buried right up here. And so all along the southern coast, so the Yemenis and Omanis, that's why they're always fighting with the Saudi Arabians, because these are Hebrew peoples and these are Kushite peoples. They're not related. And so what you end up having is probably the Hindu civilization was started by Kushites, and then they probably colonized all the way down in Southeast Asia here. And then probably like your Australian Aborigines, your Polynesian peoples, and everyone who went all the way over to like Hawaii and South America and stuff like that are probably descended from Kushites. And there's probably, some mixing as you go along here because they're colonizing one, place over at a time, and other people are colonizing too. So you have trading, wives and, stuff like that and forming relationships with other tribal groups. And over time, they're going to spread out and they're going to be more mixed. But the heartland, if you will, of the Kushite people is like right here, just like the heartland of the Gomerites. This is the eldest son of Ham. This is the eldest son of Japheth is right here. And then the eldest son of Shem is Elam, which is the predecessor of the Persians. So those are your three big chiefs, if you will, right? So as we go on now, his son Nimrod basically starts taking over all this right here. But what he's got on his back is his whole supply chain down along here. And they can just go up to, feed him what his needs are to keep his resources strong where he is, right? Because he's got essentially this big market behind his back that nobody else can touch. Does that make sense? So nobody can disrupt his supply chain for all his needs if, they want to try to keep fighting him, right? So Nimrod's in a really good place here. And then, of course, the Kushites kind of have, Egypt is Mizraim is their younger brother, so they have kind of a dominant stance over them already, but they also control upriver from them and uphill from them, and so they can press weight there if they needed to. They don't need to because they're kind of allies. Um, and the real people that they're oppressing here in the Middle East are going to be the Semites. Those are going to be the sons of Shem. And so that's why you have like Ur the Chaldees. So when you get to, if you see here, Arphaxad, the other Semite peoples are going to be Asher. Aram is going to be where your Syrian peoples come from. Arphaxad is going to be where your Babylonians come from. And then there's one more. His name is Lud, and that's where the Lydians. It's like another people that kind of intermingled with the Greeks, but they had a kingdom once. The Lydians here, and then the Elamites seem to be the main one that he's keeping intact as an ally, but they're oppressing all the other ones. So that's what they're doing. And then Eber is the son of Arphaxad, and then Eber has two sons. One is Peleg, and that's who Abraham comes from, and the other is Joktan, and that's who all these Arabian tribes come from. So they're all Hebrews. That's why they're getting together today. Okay. And so that's your basic spread, probably, at the time of the Tower of Babel, and then it kept spreading out from there. Right. And so what you have here is when Ham does his thing where he sees Noah naked and he starts making fun of him and he gets cursed for that. It's not actually Ham who gets cursed. It's his son Canaan. And I think Canaan is the youngest son of Ham, I believe, that gets cursed. And Canaan has a bunch of tribes that live right here. Well, most of these tribes you're going to hear mentioned in the times of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then in the times of Moses and Moses and Joshua taking the promised land back, right? But there's one that you don't hear mentioned, and that's going to be Sin. And Sin is where they named Mount Sinai after. And I listened to this presentation. This guy said that Sin was his name was his nickname. It's like everybody had multiple names, right? His name was the Father of Laws. Okay. And so the Muslims call Mount Sinai Jabir el-Laws because it's the mountain of the Father of Laws. Okay. Supposedly he was the guy who created the legal code that they were using in Mesopotamia before Nimrod took over. So I don't know if that was the Code of Hammurabi or what, but he was the guy who supposedly made their legal system. Okay. And so when Nimrod does his thing and starts to take over, he's out, right? And of course he's got all his relatives over here. And so that's why Sin is right here to the south of the Canaanites, but you never hear about them in the Bible. Well, the reason is because they would have migrated out. And what they probably did is they probably just followed the Cushites because they would have been already colonizing all this. So all you're doing is going from river to river, and you're either trading with them or intermarrying with them or just working for them, right? And they eventually get to here. And China is named after Sin. And they're called the Sinites. Or no, they're just called Sin in the genealogy of them. But in a prophecy in Isaiah, it says the Sinim will come from the east. And that's the Sinites. The people, the guy whose Mount Sinai is named after is the father of the Chinese. And so when you have the Chinese, you have basically two main language groups there. You have in the south, you have Cantonese, which I'm theorizing that Cantonese is just a transliteration of the name Canaanite. Like it's just a Canaanite language. And then the Han Chinese are going to speak Mandarin in the north. And I think the Han Chinese are probably descendants of Magog. And then the Chinese culture, so the Sinites, are Canaanite. And I found pictures of Egyptian pictures of Canaanites and stuff like that from hieroglyphs and stuff like that. And you can tell, like, when they'll have their pictures of stuff, and you can tell, like, this guy's definitely like a Nubian, like a Cushite. This guy's definitely like an Egyptian. Like, you can just tell by his dress and stuff like that. And he's got like darker brown skin, but not as black as the Cushites. And his hair is not as thick, not as froey, you know what I mean? And then they got the Canaanites, and they have yellowish skin and like sharper eyes, right? And what I think is that the trait of like mongoloid eye came from Magog, and the trait of yellowish skin came from the Canaanites, and then those two blended together over time, over thousands of years, and that's why basically the Chinese look distinctly the way they do, but they're a mix of the two, and that's why you have those two main language groups, which is going to be Mandarin and Cantonese. I think that's where you have your Japhethite people and your Canaanite people. So that's a little bit of theory, but I think it's a pretty solid theory. So, anyways, that's the one kind of oddball that you don't find in the Bible anymore, and it turns out he's probably China. So, anyways, that's your spread, and that's where people are. And then, later on, you have this kingdom called Urartu, which when Assyria starts to get strong, this is after Nimrod falls. This kingdom, Assyria's basically Nineveh's right here on the Tigris River, and that's kind of their top borders, the Tigris. And then just north of them is Urartu, and that's just a transliteration of Ararat. And so that's basically the main Japhethite kingdom that's kind of pressing back against Assyria, which is a Semitic kingdom. And that takes us into modern times. So, or I'm sorry, like modern biblical times, if you will. So that's where they're at. And then when you get into the New Testament era, because you're going to have multiple names for a lot of these people, you want to basically understand there's two books that I've read that are going to be very helpful if you ever want to like get to the point of like, I want to be able to teach these. That's Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews and Herodotus's Histories. Herodotus was basically a historian who lived in the time of the Greeks fighting the Persians. So before Alexander the Great, when the Persians were still strong. And then Flavius Josephus obviously writes around the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And these guys are going to draw on like Josephus is going to draw on all the top historians of his day. Herodotus is actually going to basically talk to merchants who've traveled all around the world. And he's going to collect all the different mythologies and histories that he can find. And that's why he writes this. And there's some awesome stuff in here if you guys want to. Like, there's so many connections between like the Bible and the Greeks, because there's like, one is the Oracle at Delphi talks about the Tower of Babel, and the confusion of languages there. There's something I found in like Plato's Republic that talks about these guys. Their names are like Muses and Oron or something like that, and they have a sacrificial system. And then Herodotus writes the story of basically like Egypt was called Mizraim, and it was the Greeks that named it Egypt, and they named it after this tale of Hercules and Aegyptus. Well, I've done some research on that, and Aegyptus seems like a transliteration of Jacobites, and then Hercules is Samson. And so what happens is the Danites start to leave, and they start to sail and mingle in with the Greeks, and they're carrying all the stories and making themselves sound like, you know, they're divine and they're, you know, too powerful to be beat. And so what they do is everybody knows how all the firstborn of Egypt died, right? But they don't know exactly how it happens, right? They're just hearing tales of it, right? And so the Danites seem to bring this story with them that basically says how the daughters of Aegyptus basically seduced all the princes of Egypt and then murdered them. And that's why, you know, all the firstborn of Egypt are dead when God did it. And then the story of Samson turns into a story of how Hercules basically tricked all these Egyptians to going into this temple, and then he murdered them all there. And of course, the Philistines are a Egyptian tribe. And so the Greeks, who don't know no better, they're just like, well, dang, we better not mess with these guys. And they basically become the Spartans up in there. And so they have the same flag insignia that the Danite tribe had. And they're in, there's like an island in the south of Greece where they're all staying. And then they're probably involved in the sack of Troy, like the Danites are. And then they're also, they're these sea peoples that are invading Egypt after, like 200 years after Moses and all them came out. So they know Egypt's weak, and they start basically a confederacy of people from the Sidonians, who remember they took over a Sidonian city and mixed with them. and then the Philistines, who they were marrying in with them. And then they start this confederacy, and they start pulling off raids on Egypt on a regular basis. And then it looks like they settle all these islands and stuff up in Greece. And then they eventually are involved in the sack of Troy. And then they stay mixed with the Greeks, and they don't come out until as who they are until the times of the Maccabees. And then they write a letter to the high priest of the Maccabees and says how they're relatives, and they give them the insignia of the Danites and say we're all descendants of Abraham and we're brothers. And they're basically like, we're with you. Well, that same insignia the Romans pick up, so I think the Danites might be mixed with them. And so that's going to be your other big seafaring people. But the Danites are always mixing with other peoples and hiding their identity, and they're always making up stories to make themselves seem more prominent or add to their history and stuff like that. And that's why I connect the Danites with probably the Romans, probably the Spartans, probably the Irish, and probably the Danish, because they all have like either that insignia, or they have somebody in their ancestry whose name is like Danon or Danaus or whatever as like their first king. And then they end up colonizing all this place. Well, I just found something today that was talking about, this is really interesting, because now they're starting to look at genetics to trace people to different places for their history. And it turns out genetically, the Irish, the main genetic, it's called a haplotype, but it's basically the gene sequence that designates where they're from, that is shared with the Irish, is in among the Germans and the Scandinavians, which are where the Danish are, and then central Italy, where Roma is. And I'm like, they're all Danites, man. But nobody has a Danite to prove and say, here's how we can prove they're Danites, because nobody has a Danite, right? So I'm like, I just think it's just a matter of time where a guy comes out and he's just like the Antichrist, and he's just like, I am Dan, and he just admits it, right? So that's kind of like your baseline when you get into all the tables of nations. When you go read that, you want to kind of build your own map. Like I built charts and stuff to try to link this stuff together, and I can give you guys some stuff, but you want to kind of just work this out, because when you get to the point where you're reading prophecy, you want to just like know, like, oh, that's talking about them. That's talking about them. Like you guys have probably seen my video on Gog, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so like there were literally a kingdom called Goguryeo, which is what Korea is named after. And then these people called the Gog Turks, which is just like, well, if Gog's the primary son of Magog, because we don't know who his sons were, if he was like a firstborn son or a senior son or whatever, well, then he would be dominant in this area, right? And then the Magogians, which is basically where the Mongols and the Huns come from, they would mix with the Turks because they're just raiding and pillaging. They could either be trading wives or just, alliances, or just flat out taking them. Then the people, the Turks who are allied with Gog are called Gog Turks. So it's called Gog Turks. And then Goguryeo is basically their main land. And so these people end up being the Manchurians, the Mongolians, the Koreans, and all these people. And that's where you have it all. So any questions on that before we move on?
Mm-mm.
Okay. So when the Jews get to the promised land, they're going to come in here, and basically the Philistines are going to stay pretty independent. They get subdued in David's time, but they always stay relatively independent. They never totally wipe them out or anything. The Danites start out down here, and then they just kind of just fade out, and they take over the city up here with just 300 people. But the Danites had like 72 or 73,000 soldiers when they entered into the promised land. And then by the time they get to David's day, they only have 24,000 in David's army. So they're steadily siphoning off their soldiers to go elsewhere, and they're probably raiding and pillaging and migrating and colonizing and whatnot. And then the rest of them, basically, most of them get taken away, and then some of these people from all these tribes move down to Judah, and then Judah obviously grows up to become the Jews. And so the real word for Judah is, if you look in the Bible, they're never really called Jews. That's a Western thing. They're called Judeans, or Judaios is the word in Greek. I don't know why they change it to Jews, but when I make my translation, I'm going to call them Judeans, because I think that's more like Judah. And And so that's where you have the Jewish people here. So that's your backdrop for all these prophecies that we're going to look at. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of just look at these different prophecies in chronological order and get down to laying out kind of a picture of all the successive wars that are going to come forward until we get to the Antichrist and then Armageddon. Okay. So did any of you guys read Isaiah?
I did.
Okay. So we'll probably get into that next. You guys read Joel though, right? I mean, we read it last time, but you guys read it? Okay.
I read all those passages.
Okay. So bear with me a second. So the first one we're going to look at is Psalm 83. And Psalm 83 is written by a guy named Asaph, and he was basically a songwriter in the days of David and also a prophet. And he writes like 6 or 7 Psalms, like they're all in a row. It's like 72 to 83. It might be like 8 or 9, but Psalm 83, I think is like, might be the last one of his Psalms, I think. Maybe 84 is. And he writes this psalm that doesn't really make any sense. And that's why people started picking up on it, probably in the past like 20 years. But why don't we have one of you we're just going to read through the whole thing, 1 through 18, and then we'll go back through it line by line.
I'll read it.
All right.
All right, Psalm 83. Keep not thou silence, O God. Hold not thy peace, and be not still, God. For lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people, and consulted against thy hidden ones. They have said, come, let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. For they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against thee. The tabernacles of Edom, and the Ishmaelites, and of Moab, and the Hagarenes, Gebal, and Ammon, and Amalek, the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre. Asher also is joined with them. They have holpen the children of Lot, Selah. Do unto them as unto the Midianites, as to Sisera, as to Jabin, at the brook of Kison, which perished at Endor. They became as dung for the earth. Make their nobles like Oreb and like Zeab. Yea, all their princes as Zebah and as Zalmunna, who said, let us take to ourselves the houses of God in possession. O my God, make them like a wheel, as the stubble before the wind, as the fire burneth a wood, and as the flame setteth the mountains on fire. So persecute them with thy tempest, and make them afraid with thy storm. Fill their faces with shame, that they may seek thy name, O Lord. Let them be confounded and troubled forever. Yea, let them be put to shame and perish, that men may know that thou, whose name alone is Jehovah, art the most high over all the earth.
All right. So that's a lot of really specific nations and peoples mentioned, right?
Yeah.
So raise your hand if you like read that and you're just like, I don't even know what any of that's talking about.
Oh man.
I mean,
Well,
a lot of research to figure out just who they're talking about. So every single one of these people, if I were to open up my cross references, they're all mentioned, right? But I mean, you look at this. You got Job, Deuteronomy, Exodus, Psalms, Isaiah, Judges, Zephaniah, Kings. I mean, you got a lot of work to just figure out who they're talking about. But I'm going to walk you through the short story of it. So for starters, you want to get a feel for this song. It's got 2 clear parts, right? That Selah is kind of like it's kind of like a break for a chorus or something, right? Dancing girls. And you're going to read these first 8 verses. The hook, right? The doo-wop girls. Anyways, you're going to read these first 8 verses. And what you're really hearing here is like, we got all these people conspiring to destroy us. help, right? Like you're setting the tone of like, man, this is a mess. We've got all these enemies against us. What are we going to do? And that's really how you're setting up the song. And then the second half is like saying, here's our prayer to you, God, right? Do with them like you did with these people, right? So let's just start off with the people who these are. So we'll just start to list these. It says, so we know these people are they're conspiring together to cut them off from being a nation so that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. Did that happen in ancient times?
No,
Utterly wiping them out.
no, not. Mm-mm.
Did someone try?
Yeah.
We
Who
had
tried? I
Haman.
mean, actually talk about, let's not talk about subjugating them or defeating them or plundering them, but actually wiping them out.
Well,
Haman did.
Haman, right? That's the big one. Anyone else?
I think Hitler.
Hitler did, yep. Now that's more modern times. Anybody else in modern times?
Didn't you have the guy Antiochus?
No, he didn't try to wipe them out.
Okay.
Let's try Ahmadinejad for modern.
God, yeah. See, like, you never really are trying to wipe out a people, right? I mean,
Right.
you can take their farmland if you want to, but then you got to work that farm, right?
Right.
What's the point of having the gun if you have to do the work, right? So, like, you're never really when you're dealing with whether you're dealing with right like a street gang or a military situation, you know, dominant and recessive nations, if you will, or you know, an economic scenario, or just military conquest, what have you. The goal is subjugation and dominance. It's never just wiping them out. That's why it's usually particularly evil when you see things like genocide, because genocide usually happens when it's just like, we just need to get you out of the way and we're just going to kill anybody who hits this genetic type until the rest of you get the hint and just go away because we want all your land, right? Like our population's growing too much and that's what we're going to do. And they're going to create different kinds of propaganda and reasons, hate reasons to do that, right? Like Hitler did, or like the Turks did with the Armenians, right? But like the goal is usually like, if your population's too big, then you kick out, you know, the weakest people you can find or the people who are least like your in group, right? So, you know, the Turks obviously are, you know, they're actually descended from the same forefather as the Armenians, but they're quite a bit different culturally. And the Armenians were Christian and the Turks were Muslim. Same thing with the Germans and the Jews, right? And so your goal is usually going to be to subjugate them. So these people want Israel to be wiped out, no more in remembrance. So what's the biggest move to wipe out Israel, make them no more in remembrance that we've seen in our lifetimes?
I don't know. In our lifetime?
You said a people?
Yeah, what is the, in terms of a people or a movement, what is the biggest source of wanting to see Israel wiped out as a nation in our lifetime?
Maybe the 7-Day War or 67 or so.
Well, I'm talking about like a people or a movement, not necessarily a specific conflict. Like who's saying this today?
Muslims?
The Muslims, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So now it happens to be that the some of the Muslims are starting to cozy up to Israel, right?
Right.
So we might be past this. So let's look at this closely now. So we see, it says they have consulted together with one consent, they are confederate against thee. Could we say all the Muslims together are confederate against Israel today?
To some degree, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's in a lot of their charters and their statements, right?
Right.
They make their textbooks without Israel on the map, right?
Right.
So let's break these down now. The tabernacles of Edom, who's that?
There's the enemies of the south.
Okay, but
East. That's Esau, Edom.
Esau, where are they?
South of
They're
What's that?
south of Judah.
Nope. You're close.
east, southeast,
Right. What's the name of the country they're in now?
Jordan.
Okay. What about the Ishmaelites?
There's the Arabs.
Right.
Arabs.
They'd be in Saudi Arabia. What about the Moabites?
Chinese.
They're
Nope.
from the Lot. The Moabites came from Lot to the south, I believe.
Right. So they're just north of the Edomites in Jordan. Hagarenes, this is probably one you don't know. If you're gonna try to read a commentary, there are gonna be people that are gonna say they're the descendants of Hagar, but they're not. These are actually a people group, probably a Canaanite descendant that inhabited what's now the West Bank. Gebal is in Lebanon, which is between the areas of Tyre and what's their main port city today? Beirut. So that's where Gebal is. Ammon is Moab's brother, so he's north of him in Jordan. And then Amalek is the one who's in the south of Judah. So he's actually a son of Edom. He's or I'm sorry, he's a bastard grandson of Edom. So Edom's firstborn son, he hooks up with the sister of the Hivite, the head leader of the Hivites, who is Mount Seir, the area where the Edomites eventually take over. They're the main people there, and basically his concubine's bastard son is Amalek, and that's why he's kind of isolated from the rest of the Edomites. It's because he's a bastard, and he ends up being like a bunch of roving raiders in the desert, essentially. And then we know the Philistines, right? That's the Gaza Strip.
Mm-hmm.
And then the inhabitants of Tyre, that's going to be in the south of Lebanon. And then it says Asher has joined together with them. They have helped the children of Lot. So it just so happens that Moab and Ammon, or Moab and Ammon are the children of Lot. And he's saying Asher's now helped the children of Lot. So we've got basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 people groups that are represented today really in Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Jordan, the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Which one of these stands out as being an oddball?
In
We know-
modern times,
Excuse me?
are you saying in modern times, which ones would be the
Well, even back then, I mean, I don't know how well you know your Bible times before you get, because this is in the time of David, right?
Mhm.
Most of these people, Tyre is an ally of David. Remember, he gave Solomon the wood to build the temple, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's how you know that's not, they're not against David. The Philistines are subjugated by David. Ruth, David's grandmother's a Moabite, so he's not actually fighting with them. I think it's not until after the king of, maybe it's the Moabites. I thought it was the Edomites, but the Ishmaelites they're not really fighting with. The Hagarenes are there, but they're not fighting with them. So most of these people they're not fighting with them. And then you got Asher over here. Do you know who Asher is?
Sounds like one of the 12.
You're right that Israel has a son named Asher, but it's spelled different. It's Asher. This Asher is who Assyria is named after.
Syria.
Right. So all these guys are all around Israel, right? And then Asher's way up near the Tigris River in the north. And they're not even really a big, powerful kingdom yet. They don't rise to power and start threatening Israel for probably about another 500-600 years. They're a small kingdom because this is, I mean, Nimrod's kingdom's long gone, but they've got their own problems. And, the Hittites are still strong. The Arameans are still strong around them. They've got Japhethite tribes on their border. They got Elamites and Babylonians and stuff. They're not really strong yet.
Can you say Assyrians? The Ashers are the Assyrians?
Yeah. And so I was looking at this, and this is when it hit me. These aren't nations. These are terrorist groups. Okay. Now check this out. I researched all these. Edom is going to be South Jordan, and the Ishmaelites. Those are going to be your main places where Islam started. Okay. That's going to be Muslim Brotherhood. That's going to be Muslim Brotherhood. That's the Hamas. That's going to be the PLO. That's going to be Muslim Brotherhood. That's going to be probably Muslim Brotherhood. That's going to be the West Bank, Gaza Strip. So that'd be Hamas too. And that's going to be Hezbollah. Okay. So these are all the main Islamic terror cells and where these groups have their origins that are against Israel, that are keeping Islam all out to destroy Israel, right? Guess who? So what? You know where Asher's capital is? Assyria?
I would guess Damascus.
Nope, it's Assyria.
No. Nineveh?
Nineveh, right? Do you know?
Nineveh is, what's the name of it now? I forget. The military, we've been there.
Yep.
Point a blank, but if you tell me it, I'll know.
Begins with an I. Named after the Egyptian goddess.
Well, you're going to say ISIS. No, it's
You said it. It's ISIS.
ISIS.
Yeah. So the first thing ISIS did when they took over is they sacked Nineveh and started destroying all the archaeology, like all the carvings and everything. Okay. The second thing they did is they tried to consolidate all the other different terrorist groups under their banner. So they didn't even try to attack Israel yet. They basically were trying, they were actually attacking and murdering people in other terrorist groups to make them all join the Islamic State, and they're putting them all under themselves, and then they were going to attack Israel. And that's why everyone's fighting in Damascus right now, okay? So what you have here is probably all the main places the big terror cells that have attacked Israel have grown up, and the last one to do it was ISIS, which is Asher, okay? And so what happens is, this is around, like, I want to say 2011 or so. That's when ISIS attacks Israel itself and tries to attack them in the Golan Heights. And immediately when they do, that's when all the bombing in Syria starts, and it's been going on there ever since. So they still exist, but what you have here is them getting beaten. Ever since then, Islamic terrorism has been getting stomped out because of ISIS, right? Like, Trump basically went over there and shook up the Muslim Brotherhood and the Arabs and Al Qaeda and all this other stuff so badly that they're like, we don't want to be against Israel anymore. So there's kind of a hint of what's going on here. So that's who's against Israel. ISIS is like the icing on the cake, right? That's the last one to join the fray. And then they're crying out to God for help, because now they're getting all the terrorist organizations aligned together against them. And then he says, do unto them as to the Midianites. Where are the Midianites?
That's Saudi Arabia, Midian.
Who
So
married?
that would be policing. What's his name?
Who married a Midianite?
Moses.
Right. And then where did he go? Where did he go see a burning bush?
That was in the wilderness. Was that Midian or near Midian?
It's near Midian, but what's
With Jethro.
yeah? Where was the burning bush? Charlton
Don't know.
Heston. Charlton Heston. It's Mount Sinai.
Mount Sinai.
So where Neom is being built right now, and Jabir al-Lawz and all that, that's where the Midianites are from. Okay. That's also where Medina is in that area, which is where Muhammad really got his start. So he's saying, do to them as unto the Midianites, as to Sisera, as to Jabin at the brook of Kison. What do you think? Do you know who Sisera is?
No.
He's a Midianite general from the book of Judges. And this is from Deborah and Barak. That's who they're fighting. And that's the guy who Jael drives a tent peg through his head.
Mm.
Remember that story?
Mm-hmm.
So I believe Jabin is another guy. Maybe that's the king, and Sisera is the general. And the brook of Kison is where they have their main battle. And then Sisera goes running and hiding into this tent. And the people who are in the tent are actually relatives of Moses, who, remember, Moses is a Midianite, right? But some of the Midianites, his father-in-law, he talks him into moving up amongst his kindred into the promised land. And that's who Sisera, who's also Midianite, runs into their tent and says, hey, help me, I need to hide, right? And Jael, who is an Israelitess, gives him some milk, gets him all tired, gets him going to sleep, and once he's asleep, drives a tent peg through his head and kills him. So he dies at the hand of a woman by a mortal head wound. That's important, okay? That's a hint that's going to carry forward, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So you have basically the Midianites, who are kind of they're really the main ancestors behind the Islamic movement, and you have a guy dying of a mortal head wound, okay? And then it says, which perished at Endor, they became as dung in the earth. Endor was the main place that they fought. Then it says, make their nobles like Oreb and Zeb, yea, all the princes Zeba and Zalmunna. And these are also Midianite kings. And this is Gideon who fights them, okay? And if you read the story of Gideon, Gideon defeats these kings, and then they try to make Gideon king, and Gideon doesn't want to be king. So what he does is he ends up living, large and wealthy off of his spoils from his victory. And then he has a bunch of wives and concubines and whatnot, and he ends up having 70 sons. And he sets his 70 sons up to really be like judges after he dies. And then he has this one bastard son. And that bastard son comes and kills all his 70 sons and takes over the whole thing and crowns himself king. So he sets himself up to be a false king over Israel. That's Gideon's son, right? Mm-hmm. And then he ends up getting in a fight with some town, and that town, he besieges that town. And then they all get inside a tower, like a keep. And as they're besieging the tower, a woman throws down a stone off the tower, hits his head, and crushes his head. And then he tells his a sword bearer to stab him through with a sword because he doesn't want people to say that a woman killed him. So you have two guys who die of a mortal head wound at the hands of a woman. What do you think that's signifying?
Antichrist.
Right. Like that's a clear two witnesses of an Antichrist. So what we have here is that in the context of the Midianites or the Muslims being defeated on behalf of Israel, after ISIS unites them all together and gets them all to join together, you have this guy arising twice who dies of a mortal head wound. Two witnesses, not by the hand of a man, right? Just like the Antichrist. So it's very cryptic, but what you have here, this is your general backdrop, and this is what I wrote. When I did this Bible study in 2015, I said, here's what's going to happen. And this is before any of the peace treaties. I said, this is going to lead to the defeat of Islamic terrorism once and for all. And after that, you're going to have people start to side with Israel among Muslims. And in that context, the Antichrist is going to arise. So that's how I interpreted this. So that was back in 2015 when I made that interpretation. And of course, ISIS is getting their butts kicked. Now you're seeing Saudi Arabians and a lot of Arabians now start to ally with Israel. Sudan, Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, a number of Islamic countries are starting to cozy up to Israel. And now even Turkey is starting to make propose like sea treaties and oil and natural gas treaties with Israel. So it's all starting to come about. So that's kind of your general prophecy that essentially, like when Israel starts getting this victory over these Islamic enemies, that's when the Antichrist is going to rise. Okay. That's why I don't buy into the Islamic Antichrist theory, because I already had this nailed down before I even knew about the Islamic Antichrist theory. So that's Psalm 83, and that's the oldest one of these prophecies. That's in the time of David. Now, we go forward, and we have Micah 5 or Micah and Isaiah are probably around the same time, and honestly, Joel is probably contemporary. So here's the interesting thing is that war that I told you about in Isaiah, Randy, all of these prophets, Isaiah, Micah, and Joel, are probably all pretty contemporary to each other, and they're all written. The war happens during Isaiah's time, but Joel and Micah at the most are within a generation of that. They're all right by each other. So that's how you know, like, these things, this war that foreshadows the Gog-Magog invasion has Micah 5, Isaiah 17 through 19, and Joel 2 all happen right before it, which kind of tells you that these things are going to be prophecies that are going to affect things right before the Gog-Magog invasion. So let's start with Micah 5 and read that, and then we'll call that a night after we're done with Micah 5. It's just one page.
All right.
Where are we at here?
Y'all ready?
Yeah, I got it. Go ahead whenever you're ready. Start with verse 1 and then read down to the bottom of verse 6. And keep in mind what we just read, okay?
Right. So Micah chapter 5, verse 1. Now gather thyself in troops, our troops. He hath laid siege against us. They shall smite the judge of Israel with a rod upon. But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though among the thousands of Judah,
Can you
yet
pause?
out of these shall he come forth, that is to be ruler. And
Michael? Can you hear me?
yeah.
I can hear like literally like every other sound you're making. Can you guys hear him okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
No, you had some lag time, Mike. I was having trouble hearing you too.
Okay. Tyson, you want to just read this one because you sound fine on mine.
All right.
Yeah, go ahead and read. I'm having a connection over here issue. So yeah, go ahead and read.
Okay. Micah chapter 5, verse 1. Now gather thyself in troops, O daughter of troops. He hath laid siege against us. They say they shall smite the judge of Israel with a rod upon the cheek. But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting. Therefore will he give them up until the time that she which travaileth hath brought forth. Then the remnant of his brethren shall return unto the children of Israel. And he shall stand and feed in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall abide. For now shall he be great unto the ends of the earth. And this man shall be the peace when the Assyrians shall come into our land, and when he shall tread in our palaces. Then shall we raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 principal men. And they shall waste the land of Assyria with sword, and the land of Nimrod and the entrances thereof. Thus shall he deliver us from the Assyrian when he cometh into our land, and when he treadeth within our borders.
So we got this passage, and obviously there's things that a lot of people are going to draw on because Bethlehem Ephrathah is where? Why does that pop?
Well, Bethlehem was where Christ was born, right?
Right, right. So what do most people who read this think this whole prophecy is about?
Well, Christ taking over. I mean, like a
Here's the thing
military
about it's about
siege.
Right. So when we see this man shall be the peace, most people assume this man must be Christ, right?
Right.
Because it just talks about Bethlehem, right?
right.
Mhm.
And so therefore you'll have people say that the Assyrian
Right.
is another name for the Antichrist, right?
hmm
Can you think of any other verse in scripture that calls the Antichrist the Assyrian?
No.
No. So that is suspect because we don't have 2 or 3 witnesses, and I've searched the scripture, have it, right?
Mhm.
The other thing that's suspect is the word man is not in the text. It just says, "And this shall be the peace." Okay. So let's read this now from the beginning. It says, "Now gather yourself in troops or daughter troops. He has laid siege against us, and they shall smite the judge of Israel with a rod upon the cheek." So who's laid siege against us?
Oh,
Is it clear
I'm gonna.
based on this
It's
passage?
gonna. It's not clear.
Right. So what you really want to do to understand that part, and this is where people mess up, remember the chapters weren't there in the beginning, right? I'm going back into chapter 4, and it talks about how in the last days you'll come to pass that the mountain and the house of the Lord shall be established in the housetop of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow into it. So this is talking about the millennium, right? And then it's going to talk to everybody going up to the mountain of the Lord, but in their present time, it's actually going to be prophesying that they're going to be taken into captivity in Babylon. So he says, "And thou, O tower of the flock, stronghold of the daughter of Zion, it shall come from the first dominion, the kingdom shall come from the daughter of Jerusalem. Now why dost thou cry aloud? Is there no king in thee? Is thy counselor perished? For pangs have taken thee like a woman in travail." What does that sound like?
Birth pains.
Birth pangs, right? And then it says, "Be in pain and labor and bring forth, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in travail. But now shalt thou go forth out of the city, and thou shalt dwell in the field, and thou shalt go even to Babylon, and there you shall be delivered. There the Lord shall redeem thee from the hand of your enemies," right? So when you have these travails and you have words like desolation and things like that, you got to remember the first version of that was the ancient destruction of Jerusalem by Babylon. The next version is going to be the destruction by the Romans, and then the final version is going to be in the last days, right?
Mhm.
So he's actually prophesying their destruction by Babylon here. And then it says, and he says, "And now many nations are gathered together against thee that say, Let her be defiled, let our eye look upon Zion. But they know not the thoughts of the Lord or understand his counsel, for he shall gather them as sheaves into the floor. Arise and thresh, O daughter of Zion. I will make thine horn iron, and I will make thy hoops brass. And thou shalt beat in pieces many people, and I will consecrate their gain unto the Lord and their substance unto the Lord of the whole earth." So what he's doing is he's paralleling their present. This is really in the days around the days of Isaiah, so they're still like 100 years off from Babylon sacking them, but he's paralleling Babylon taking them into captivity, and then their deliverance from Babylon to what happens in the last days and in the millennium. Because remember, that whole 70-year captivity to Babylon gets expanded out to the entire captivity of the Gentiles, right? So you have to put that gap premise in it and understand he's attaching the ancient captivity to Babylon all the way to the millennium there. Okay. So when you start to read prophecies, you're going to find this over and over and over again. It's either going to be Israel being taken captive by Assyria or Israel being taken captive by Babylon, projected onto something that's going to be already and not yet, and ultimately lead you to the millennium. And so then it says, "Now gather thyself in troops, O daughter of troops. He has laid siege against us. They shall smite the judge of Israel with a rod upon the cheek." Okay. So this is actually the he that lays siege against us is going to be Nebuchadnezzar here. And then it says, "They shall smite the rod of Israel with a rod upon the cheek." Do you know what Nebuchadnezzar does to the king of Israel?
He kills him outside of Jerusalem as he's fleeing, I believe.
He kills his sons, but he doesn't kill the king.
Yeah, he puts his eyes out.
Yeah, he puts his eyes out, right? Is there somebody else who gets his eye blotted out?
Samson,
Yep, Samson's one. Where's he from?
Dan,
Philistine, Dan,
He's from Dan. Who else gets an eye blotted out?
the Antichrist,
Yeah.
Antichrist.
Does he get smitten with a rod?
the
Yeah,
rod,
yeah.
right?
Christ is the rod.
Right, right. So he gets the rod of judgment. The other thing is, what does Dan's name mean?
Judge.
Judge.
Judge, right? Does it
Judgment.
say, I'm going to smite the king of Israel?
Mm.
Doesn't
Mm.
judge Israel, right? So,
Judge.
so the king that Nebuchadnezzar puts his eyes out, is he a good king or a bad king?
No, he's a bad king.
Right. That's why it gets besieged, right?
Yeah.
So you see these connections between him and Samson, him and Dan, and the Antichrist, right? But then we also know, does Jesus get smitten with a rod?
Mm.
The rod of
Mike
man.
the shepherd. That's Zechariah.
Right. I'll smite the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered, right? What about, do you remember when the Roman soldiers have him?
Mm-hmm.
They smite him with a rod on the cheek, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who hit you?
Right. So these are things that are going to have parallels in them in ancient times, in Christ's time, and also in the Antichrist, okay? And so again, we're still kind of looking at it in that already not yet framework. But now he takes you definitely, this is to Jesus, right? Thou Bethlehem Ephrathah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of these shall come forth unto me that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth should be from old to everlasting. So here's how you know, like, he's striking this person with a rod upon the cheek, and that's really representing Israel being subjugated by Babylon. But because remember how he said in the last one how it said you'd be without a king, right?
Mhm.
So their king gets subjugated, but Bethlehem Ephrathah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, out of ye shall come forth unto me that is to be ruler in Israel. So in other words, they're going to be without a king because he's going to get smitten, right? And then a new king is going to come forth whose goings forth have been from old, from everlasting. So obviously he's the eternal king, right? So that is Jesus. And then he says, therefore will he give them up. So who's giving them up?
Sounds like God's giving them up.
Well, based on what we read, it's got to be pointing to something we just read if he's saying he, right?
It's going to be Christ.
Right. So Christ will give them up until the time that she which travails has brought forth. Now, does that sound like something we just read in Hosea?
Yeah, it sounds very familiar.
He says, I will return to my place until what?
Until they acknowledge their fault.
Right. When does she that travails bring forth?
When they go through tribulation and cry out to the Lord with fasting and
Right. So if you remember in Revelation 12, and we haven't gotten that far yet, the woman flees into the wilderness after she gives birth, right? That's the time they look upon him who they pierce and they mourn, right? So that's the time they acknowledge their offense. And so it's taking you right up to Revelation 12 and the rapture, okay? And so he says, from that time when she has travailed, brought forth, that's the man-child who's supposed to rule with a rod of iron. Then the remnant of his brethren shall return to the children of Israel. What's that talking about?
Two witnesses.
This whole prophecy of Jesus was given at the time of King Hezekiah. I mean, just before the King Ahaz. So the timing is just like, hey, you're going into Babylon. And by the way, this virgin birth.
Right. This is actually very parallel to that in Isaiah, right? With King Ahaz and the virgin birth. So
yeah,
you see that, but he's always masking the two comings of Christ. That's why he says he's going to give them up until that she that travails brings forth. And that's why they're expecting their deliverance after the virgin birth. But we know there's a second woman travailing, giving forth in Revelation 12, right? Which is a spiritual woman of Israel, if you will. Then the remnant of his brethren shall return to the children of Israel, because who are the true children of Israel?
Those who are born again of the Spirit.
Right. So the remnant of his brethren must be who?
The 144,000.
Yeah, that's the first fruits of them.
Right.
But it's really all the ethnic Jews that repent and last.
Right.
They return to the
Right.
children of Israel, which is the full company of the people of God, right?
Right.
So that's what he's saying, how this is going to end. So we have the first coming of Christ here and the second coming of Christ here, right? So this is going to be kind of a meanwhile thing. Now we know this is the first coming. This is the ancient captivity of Israel. This is the first coming of Christ. This is the second coming of Christ. But we know that he's going to give them up for a time, right? So now we're going to go back to that time that he's given them up. And he says, and he shall stand and feed in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall abide. So if he's standing and feeding in the strength of the Lord and the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, what's this referring to?
You know, when he comes back and he's in his, you know, he's got gray hair and all that. That's what I'm thinking, you know, comes back in his glory.
You think this is after the second coming?
No, this is in the meantime.
Right. So what is Christ?
So
What is Christ doing
before Christ comes?
What is
So
he?
he's seated at the right hand of the Father, and you know, in His glory, and that's why I just remember in the past lesson we were like, his gray hair signifies that maturation, and you know.
Well, but that's probably an image of the Father, because the lamb.
Okay.
Remember the lamb as if it was slain. That's the Son.
Right.
So what he's doing is he's standing before God as our high priest right now.
Okay.
So he's at the right hand of God, seated on the throne, and he's interceding for us. And then it says, and they shall abide. Who abides?
Sounds like believers,
Right. What
spiritual believers.
What passage pops out at you for abide?
I go and prepare a place for you.
Right. So he's gone. He's going to prepare a place for them. And he says, if you abide in me and I abide in you, right, you will bear much fruit, right?
Right.
And then it says, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth. So if we're abiding and he's interceding, what is him being great to the ends of the earth?
He conquering. Wouldn't he be going forth conquering?
Nope. Think about it. In the context, we have Jesus standing at the right hand of the Father interceding for us, and us abiding in him. And now he shall be great to the ends of the earth. What's him being great to the ends of the earth now?
It sounds like 1,000 years.
Well, establishing his kingdom spiritually.
Right, which is called what? What are we doing?
Kingdom.
Preaching the
gospel to the ends of the earth.
Right. We're proclaiming his glory to the ends of the earth, right? We're preaching the gospel to the ends of the earth. So this is literally saying, okay, he's going to give up Israel until the time of the rapture, right? In the meantime, Jesus is going to be standing there in the strength of the Lord interceding for us. We're going to be abiding in him, and we're going to be spreading the gospel. So we're in the meantime, okay, still?
Right.
So we assume then we're still in the meantime when we read the next one, because it says and, right? And this, remove the word man, and this shall be the peace, when the Assyrians shall come into our land. What did we just say Asher was?
ISIS.
And when did ISIS start getting defeated and bombed by everybody?
Like, when did they start getting defeated?
Yeah. What did they do before they started getting defeated?
What did they do before? They were cutting Christians' heads off, and they're doing terrorist attacks, and they wanted to get rid of Israel and
That's something I
establish
forgot.
Sharia law.
I forgot to mention something about that because you mentioned the attacks on Christians. When we go back to Psalm 83, Check this out. He says, they have taken crafty counsel against thy people and consulted against thy hidden ones. Chuck Missler makes a point of this. In the context of this prophecy, who's thy people?
Israel.
So who are thy hidden ones?
The church.
Church.
Right. They're hidden in a mystery, right?
Mm,
So ISIS, who's gathering all the terrorist groups, are against the Christians and the Jews, right?
yep.
So when we get here, that's why I want to make note of that, because it says this man shall be the peace when the Assyrians shall come into our land. So remember what I told you what happened? You guys need to look for this video. It's on YouTube. When ISIS, I kid you not, when ISIS finally tried to attack Israel directly in the Golan Heights, this like wall of cloud came up. Like they were trying to shoot at him, and this wall of cloud just came up and just blinded him. It's on YouTube, man. It's like they're literally sitting there in the Gaza Strip and they can't see nothing. It's like, and literally the videos are like from Israel, like the angel Michael's protecting us. It's dope. Anyways, it says, this shall be the peace when he shall tread in our palaces. When he shall tread in our palaces. One of the things, this is what ISIS did. ISIS tried to attack them in the Golan Heights, and then ISIS sponsored a terrorist attack on the Temple Mount. So when the Assyrian shall come to our land, he shall tread in our palaces. It says, then we shall raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 principal men. What do you think that is? Can you think of another part of scripture that has 7 and also 8 in it?
We read it. Can't remember though.
Randy, you got any ideas? You're muted, Randy.
Sorry. I'm thinking that it sounds like Revelation where 10 are there, 7 are ripped out, but there's an 8th to come that is part of the 7.
Right. The 8th is one of the 7, right? So when you see, this is called a Hindiatus, when you see something that's 7 and also 8, it's like the baptism of the washing of regeneration and the renewal of the Holy Ghost. They're 2 ways of saying the baptism of the Holy Spirit, right?
Mm-hmm.
The 7 shepherds are also 8 principal men. Well, in Revelation, it says, and the 8th is one of the 7, and he will go into perdition. Okay.
Right.
So the 7 principal men, here's what it is. If you remember how there's 10 kings, right? Who apparently are over your international fascist government, if you will. But the Antichrist succeeds in plucking out 3 of them. And so you have 7 left, right?
Right.
And then the Antichrist also becomes an 8th. Why?
He dies and it's resurrected.
Right. In the image of the beast, right? So that's why the 8th is also one of the 7. Okay. So it just so happens this conflict with ISIS and Syria and all the stuff that's been going on since this has been going on since for over 10 years now. Okay. I counted to see how many nations are actually involved in it, and meaning involved, they either got troops on the ground or they're bombing. Okay. And I found Saudi Arabia, Jordan, I think maybe the UAE, and then France, England, and the US, and Turkey. Okay. There's 7. And then on the other side, you have Iran, China, and Russia. There's 3. Okay. Now, could you see those 10 powers getting together and forming a global one world government? Is there enough power there to do that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Maybe not those exact powers, but something like that, right?
Right.
But there's definitely 7 on one side and 3 on the other. And the oddball in it is Turkey, because they're not really on a side. But now they're starting to cozy up to Israel. But it says this shall be, so that's why I want you to take man out here. It says, this shall be the peace when the Assyrian shall come in our land, and when he shall tread in our palaces. Then, or at that time, shall we raise up against him 7 shepherds and 8 principal men. So what they're saying is, you take the word man out, which is not in the original text. He's saying the peace is going to be when we raise up 7 shepherds, even 8 principal men. So who's the we?
Israel.
Right. They come into our land and we raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 principal men. Does that sound like the Lord saving them?
Nope.
No.
No. What does it sound like they're doing?
They're joining up with other nations to defend themselves.
Right. Remember that thing we read in Zechariah where it says the governors of Judah will say the people of Jerusalem will be the strength, our strength in the Lord of hosts, their God.
Right.
I think these 7 shepherds are the governors of Judah. And one of them is the Antichrist. So we literally got America, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, France, England, UAE, and Jordan, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Antichrist comes from one of those. Is that surprising that he might come from one of those countries?
No.
I mean, you got like the 3 most powerful countries in Europe. You got, or I'm sorry, yeah, three most powerful militaries in Europe. You got America, you got Turkey, you've got Saudi Arabia and Jordan. We know it's not Jordan because Jordan escapes from his hand, right? Edom, Moab, and the chief princes of Ammon escaped from his hand. But all those other countries that we just named literally have somebody in it who people are saying is the Antichrist right now. Tayyip Erdogan, Emmanuel Macron, Prince Henry, Donald Trump, right? And the president of or the king of Saudi Arabia, right? You literally got 5 dudes right now who somebody is saying is the Antichrist, right? And that's probably what it's going to be like. Is like it's not going to be obvious who the Antichrist is unless you really know your Bible prophecy. Until he sits in the temple and claims that he's God, it's going to be like, which one of them is it, right? And so basically, he's saying when the Assyrian comes into their land, which is going to be, it's going to start with ISIS, but it's really going to grow into the Gog Magog invasion because we're going to get into that next week with the Isaiah prophecies. He says, then shall, it says, and they shall waste the land of Assyria. So notice it's not the Lord, it's these 7 shepherds and 8 principal men, right? They shall waste the land of Assyria with the sword and the land of Nimrod and the entrances thereof. So what are these 2 places today called? Assyria and the land of Nimrod.
Nimrod, Iraq.
Iraq and Syria, right? In the entrances thereof, thus shall he deliver us from the Assyrian when he comes into our land and when he treads within our borders, okay? So the start of this, the kickoff to this, again, when we read Psalm 83, we know it's going to happen after ISIS consolidates all the terrorists together against them. And then when they start getting defeated by these 7 shepherds, even 8 principal men, is after they cross the borders, right? But who else crosses the borders later on?
It said he delivered us from the Assyrian.
Remember Joel 2? We read that?
Mm-hmm.
A great army from where?
From
The north.
right?
Right. So Gog Magog, right? So what starts out as this little incursion from ISIS, which really gets the ball rolling on this alliance, is going to turn into, again, who's the other side against these 7, right? China, Russia, Iran. Those are the main powers in the Gog Magog war, right? So it says, and then the remnant of Jacob will be in the midst of many people as dew from the Lord and as showers upon the grass that tarrieth not for man nor waiteth for the sons of men. So one of the things that Israel's starting to do now is attack Iranian bases and stuff like that without asking the U.S. for permission. So notice it says, they'll be like dew from the Lord that tarrieth not for man nor waiteth for the sons of men. In other words, they're not waiting for anyone's permission anymore. The remnant of Jacob shall be among the Gentiles in the midst of many people, like a lion among the beasts of the forest, as a young lion among the flocks of sheep, who, if he goes through, both treadeth down and teareth into pieces, and none can deliver. who's like a lion and a young lion?
You got
Christ, Judah and Dan.
Right,
Judah and Dan.
right. So who's like a lion and a young lion? We know it's Christ, right?
Right.
Yeah.
We know the Antichrist also personates it, but in this prophecy, who's like a lion and a young lion?
Young lion would be Dan, Antichrist.
Right, but I'm saying in this prophecy, who's like a young lion here?
Remnant of Jacob. Well, the remnant of Jacob would be, you would think that would be Israel, but it says Jacob.
Right. Is that Jacob after the flesh or after the spirit?
The flesh.
Flesh.
Flesh. So Jacob after the flesh is getting the glory of Christ. The people who, right? It says, my strength will be in the inhabitants of Jerusalem, in their God, right? So the world is looking to the nation, the ethnic people of Israel, like they should be looking to Christ. Okay, that's who they are among the Gentiles, like a lion among the beasts of the forest. So that's king, right? And a young lion among the flocks of sheep. So think about that. A young lion among the flocks of sheep. Is that a good thing?
No, that's bad.
So among the Gentiles, they're like a lion in the midst of the forest. That's talk about the nations, right? A young lion among the flocks of sheep. We know who else is a young lion?
Dan.
Besides
Antichrist.
Antichrist. Who's the flocks of sheep?
Believers.
Hmm?
The Israelis, the Jacob after the flesh.
Nope. Think about the flocks of sheep.
The church?
Right. Because Jacob after the flesh is right here.
Oh,
He's going to be like a young lion among the flocks of sheep. See, the church is looking to Israel like as if they're Christ. So he's impressing the nations and the church, who if he goes through, so that's the remnant of Jacob, both treadeth down and teareth in pieces, and none can deliver. Remember what Jesus said it would be like in the last days? They're going to take you up before who?
Judges and
The synagogues.
synagogues. Yeah, synagogue.
Right? So all of a sudden, the Jews are leading the persecution of the Christians. That's what that's saying.
Mm.
Then it says, thine hand shall be lifted up upon thine adversaries, and all thine enemies shall be cut off. So that seems like they're winning everything, right? And it shall come to pass in that day, saith the Lord, that I will cut off thy horses out of the midst of thee, and I will destroy thy chariots. Who's the Lord talking to?
Israel.
Israel, right? I will cut off the cities of thy land and throw down all thy strongholds. I will cut off the witchcrafts out of thine hand, and thou shalt have no more soothsayers. Thy graven images I will also cut off, and thy standing images out of the midst of thee. What do you think that's referring to? Thou shalt no more worship the work of thine hands. What do you think that's talking about?
The image they set up.
The image of the beast, right?
Yep.
I will pluck up thy groves out of the midst of thee, so I will destroy thy cities. And I will execute vengeance in anger and fury upon the heathen, such as they have not heard. Is the heathen talking about Gentiles here necessarily? It's everybody who's worshiping the beast, right?
Right.
So what he's saying is, see, Israel's saying this will be the peace when we raise up our alliance of our 7 kings under the Antichrist, right? And he's saying when you do that, when that happens, God's gonna discipline you and execute vengeance upon all the idol worshippers and the heathens, right?
Right.
And all this is gonna happen when she that travails brings forth. So he basically just says, here's your first coming and here's your second coming, and now here's how it's gonna happen. He's gonna stand and feed. In other words, he's going back to his place till they acknowledge their offense, right? And in the meantime, the church is going to spread his glory to the ends of the earth by spreading the gospel. And then once ISIS breaks that border and the Gog Magog happens, this alliance is going to come together, and Israel's out of that alliance is going to come the Antichrist, and they're going to take out Syria and Iraq, which is what the Antichrist takes over, right? And then the Jews are going to look like a boss, and the whole world's going to be flocking to the Jews and to the temple and all that stuff, and then they're going to set up the image of the beast for them to worship. And then Christ is going to execute their vengeance on them. But what's going to happen right before they set up the image of the beast?
Rebuild the temple, right?
That's going to happen before, but what happens right before they set up the image of the beast? Immediately before. I got it highlighted just for a hint.
Jesus destroys the
Antichrist. Yeah.
Right.
The brightness of his coming.
And the brightness of his coming, and what happens? Rapture happens, but what about the Antichrist? How does he get hit up?
In the head.
Right. Spitting on the cheek, right?
Right.
So the way he has it, it's kind of, kind of mixed around, right? So it's not really obvious the order of everything, because everything about Christ's first and second coming is like that in the Old Testament. So you don't really know when it's coming. But he basically just said the judge of Israel is the Antichrist. Okay, now this is Christ in a type, because all the stuff that the Antichrist does here and in Zechariah and all this stuff, there's going to be a version of it that Christ does, but a version of it the Antichrist does, because the Antichrist is copying Christ, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
But ultimately, he's telling him when the Antichrist goes down, because all this stuff is talking about how it's going to be when Jesus comes to rule. Everything, when you went back to Micah 4, is talking about how it's going to be when Jesus comes to rule. And so he's basically saying he's going to come to rule after he smites the judge of Israel, the Antichrist, on the cheek. Then the everlasting king's going to rule. But for now, he's going to give them up until she that travails. That's why if you go back to Micah 4, he says, why does thy cry aloud? Is there no king in thee? Is thy counselor perished? For pangs have taken thee like a woman in travail. That's where they are without a king, right? And he's telling him, I'm going to come be king after I've knocked that other dude out, right? And then he gives them the story of how it's gonna take place. And what he's telling the Jews kind of cryptically in here and in Zechariah is, when you think you're on top, that's when you're going to get full of pride. That's when the Antichrist is going to come, and that's when God's going to chasten you to repentance. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The last verse in Zechariah 8 says, the very last verse, 10 people take hold of the hem of a Jew.
Right.
God is with you.
Right, and we talked about that. Who are the 10 people?
I'm thinking the 10 are the 10 that we've been talking about earlier today. That becomes 7.
And then who's the Jew?
Antichrist.
Right. It's probably just all of Jerusalem, right? The remnant of Jacob here, right? So that's going to lead us into where we need to connect the Assyrian now, not just with ISIS, not just with Asher, but also with Gog Magog, okay? And so in the next one, we're going to read that Isaiah prophecy next week that we talked about. And then we're probably going to want to read these other ones, Isaiah 17 through 19, because these are other prophecies that are going to be all around it. And we'll just try to do as much as we can in Isaiah. There's quite a bit between the Assyrian invasion and between this other stuff. So maybe if you guys could just read all of them and we can just talk about them and skip around. There's a lot of meat there, but we're also going to get Isaiah 2 and Isaiah 24 later on. And then we'll circle back to Gog Magog to wrap it up, okay?
Cool.
So we've got kind of our backdrop, with the Table of Nations. Again, kind of review that. And like I said, if you guys have an ambition to teach this to other people, you want to get to a place where you kind of know that Table of Nations like the back of your hand, just in terms of where they're spread out. And that story I painted for you is kind of like, this is how you can explain it in a way that's reasonable so people can understand why they're in these different places. Because these people will say, well, no, Gog is in Turkey and Magog's in Turkey and Meshech's in Turkey and these other places are in Turkey. And then you just want to ask them, well, then where did the Mongols come from? Where did the Chinese come from? You know what I mean? Like, where did the Turks come from? Do these people just pop out of the ground? Or, you know what I mean? Like, you have to have an explanation where all the peoples in the world came from. That's why it's like, I could go into a whole bunch more detail about the Japhethite peoples or the Hamite peoples in Africa. And like, there's so much wealth there, but you still just want to have a general consensus, especially for the nations that are named in the Bible, to go, here's how we know they're over there and not over here. and then we can align this stuff with geopolitics. And by the time we get done to the end of Gog Magog, it's going to be very clear the geopolitical scenario because we're living in it right now. So I've been watching this since I was in college 15, 16 years ago, and it's like obvious how it's going down, but it's hard to convince other people because they start out with a bunch of theories about who the Antichrist is, and they work their way back into all the other prophecies and try to make it work.
So it's not Jared Kushner.
He's still my number one candidate for the false prophet. I'll say that. But the false prophet could be a lot of people out there, man. False prophet,
Yeah.
I have a feeling like he's going to be more of a technology guy than a religious guy. That's my feeling. So he could be Bill Gates, he could be Elon Musk, because he causes the image of the beast to speak, which tells me he's a technology guy.
Mm.
So yeah, Jared Kushner's on my list because of his peace deals. If I had to pick two people today, I would say Tayyip Erdogan or some successor of him and Jared Kushner. But, we can only speculate based on what we see on the world stage now, and God might raise up totally different people because, again, it's not supposed to be obvious who the Antichrist is until you're in Daniel's 70th week. So, but yeah, you guys, again, we'll probably spend at least a couple weeks in Isaiah and then wrap it up with Gog Magog and then get back into Revelation 6 to wrap it up. So we're probably looking at a solid 3 to 4 weeks left before we're done with this whole war scenario. Okay.
All right.
Any questions or thoughts or anything anyone needs prayer for?